Hello, hello. Hope you're doing well. I'm doing great. Tonight's night 22 of this journey. As always, thanks so much for joining me and helping me stay alcohol free for 22 days now. So I appreciate the support. It's really cool to just see me get this far and just see where it's going. So I know I say it every time, but I can't say enough. So thanks so much for just helping me. I appreciate it. Uh, Kind of want to get straight into tonight's topic because I didn't get to finish everything I wanted to say last night, and this is really the primer here. This is what I was trying to build up to. I've mentioned this, I know, in a couple earlier episodes, maybe only one of my entries, but there's a TED Talks that I wanted to talk about, a TED Talks regarding addiction specifically, and it's called "Everything You Know About Addiction Is Wrong." Uh, Very good TED Talks. Probably one of my favorites. Very insightful. Made just a lot to think about, a lot to process in there. A lot of it's a very good branch into just a big pool of information. Uh, but that's what I wanted to go into. Uh, Everything You Know About Addiction Is Wrong. A TED Talks presented by a reporter. I believe his name is pronounced Yohani Hari. It might be Johan or Johan. I'll call him Johan Hari. But he presented this TED Talks uh, called "Everything You Know About Addiction Is Wrong," and he had some interesting things to say in his TED Talks. So Hari, which I'll just call him from now on, Hari's just easier. Uh, he had his own motivations to explore addiction, figure out. He just had a lot of questions from it. He had a lot of family motivations too. Families struggled from addiction, and so he was very motivated to just research into addiction. He really wanted to start with the basic question of where does it come from, and answer that. Became fascinated with it. So this eventually led him, throughout years of research, it led him to discovering someone named Dr. Bruce Alexander. Dr. Bruce Alexander conducted a really interesting experiment, but kind of before that, Dr. Bruce Alexander disputed, or he questioned the idea that addiction was like the mind depending on a certain chemical in the brain. Because Dr. Bruce Alexander, I'll just call him Dr. Alexander, he had, in his thought experiment, he realized that people will go to hospital for injuries or other reasons, and they will they'll be given morphine for several days straight, sometimes multiple times throughout a day, and when they come out, they're not addicts. So, you've just incorporated, a drug into this person's body, and you're establishing the chemical hooks. And he disputed this idea of chemical hooks. Is primarily it that you put it into your body, and then your body needs it suddenly. He thought that it's more about the environment. He sees it as kind of a social disorder or a social phenomenon. So he had this interesting idea. They called the Rat Park experiment. In the Rat Park experiment, he took two clusters, two groups of rats. One group, he isolated them into their own small cages, and the other group he put into Rat Park. And in Rat Park was essentially rat heaven, loads of food, loads of tunnels, lots of space, equal male to female ratio, so there was lots of mating. They got a little crazy in that area, but it was just rat heaven. And he gave both sets, each rat in their own cage, their small cage, and the rats in rat heaven, he gave all of them access to fresh, clean, healthy water and sweetened morphine water. The ones in the isolated cages, they couldn't stop drinking the morphine water. They were drinking it all of the time. The ones in Rat Park, they avoided it. They spent all their time just interacting with each other. I mean, they were, there's reports of lots of, mating, lots of interaction, lots of like, just everything. They lived very fruitful, productive lives. The ones in the cages would just drink the morphine water and kind of waste away. And Dr. Alexander even did some other steps where, follow-up steps to the experiment, where he took some of the rats, some of the isolated rats, and he moved them into the rat park after some time. And in rat park, after being introduced into rat park, where they had connections, available again, they weaned off the morphine water and eventually began drinking just the regular water and began acting like normal rats. The normal rats in the situation, they began acting like the other rats in rat heaven. They adjusted to their environment. So far, the experiment leading to the conclusion that it's the cage, it's the environment that the individual or the organism finds himself in, not that is causing an addiction to something rather than a chemical type of need. Now, there's some criticisms to the experiment, like the isolated rats. That's all they could do. There was very little room for movement. There was just, it's a small cage with regular water and morphine water. What options do you have? Really, though, that reinforces the kind of point of the experiment, because the options are being limited by the environment. The environment is the driving force in that circumstance. So to point out that, they had a lesser environment, I mean, that's kind of the point of the experiment. If you change the environment, you can essentially eliminate addiction, is what Dr. Alexander's trying to show. But after that, still in the TED Talks, talking in the realm of the TED Talks, because Hari found Dr. Alexander's experiment, the rat park experiment, which led Hari to pretty much conclude that the addiction is a social, sort of like a social engagement or lack thereof, or restriction of a social type of engagement, connection. Another thing he brings up, though, in his TED Talks is the example of Portugal. So Portugal is a very interesting, example. They had one of the worst, at one point they had one of the worst drug problems in the world. 1%, a solid 1% and more were, increasing more, were addicted to heroin. 1% of the population of Portugal was addicted to heroin, and that was only increasing. HIV and all sorts of other diseases along those lines were just so widespread, and just it was like a wildfire. It was only growing worse and worse, getting fast rapidly. Now, what Portugal did is they actually applied the findings, the research from Dr. Alexander about it all being connection. About addiction all being based around connection. What Portugal did then is completely reconstructed their system with how they handle addiction. First off, they decriminalized all drugs. There is some like situational charges for some things, but it's those are more weird, specific, almost like crime-related circumstances where hefty amounts, of certain drugs or something. I think it's more than like a 10-day or 2-week possession of something would then get you administration charges, but they decriminalized it, so it's not a criminal charge. They stopped putting them in jails. Portugal realized through Dr. Alexander's research that if you take that and apply that to people or addicts, where if you have an addict and you put them back in a cage, you put them back in an environment that's with strained connections, they can't fail. It only perpetuates the addiction. So in order to resolve the problem rather than just keep it going, a punishment was just keeping it going. What they did is they took all of the money, they decriminalized it, took all of the money that they were putting into prosecuting, punishing any of these like other programs that you have to do with any type of like if you were an addict. They took all that away, took all the money that cost to, like I said, prosecute and punish the addicts, and they took that money and used that as an investment into them. Now this varies depending on the addict and the circumstance, but just speaking generally, because I can only really speak generally here, their recovery program invests into the addict. They help them find new work, make sure they have stable housing. It reincorporates that addict back into society. If you make that addict important, it sounds so risky, but that's and almost in a way like backwards, but that's because we've done it the wrong way for so long, and that's why we still have this problem, because we're handling it wrong. And while this method of like, oh, you're an addict, well, let's make you important in the society, then you'll have something else to depend on. There's other people here that you've now established a social bond. You can't let them down. You're an important part of the society. If you invest into the addict, you re-establish their connections to the society, to their environment, and you make them an important part. So to say, they become addicted to that. That's their dependency. You've replaced the addictive behavior with connection. Portugal's recovery program reincorporates, reconnects the addict back into the society, making them an important part, eliminating that the addiction, or as Hari would put it, that lack of connection. Because in his TED Talks, his conclusion, his thesis is that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Now I want to get into the clarifications and criticisms I have with the TED Talks. It's mostly just a few things with, not that I'm saying it's bad. Like I said, I agree with 90% of the TED Talks. It's important information and needs to be heard about even more. But at the end, Hari concludes that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. And we're kind of mixing up definitions there, because we kind of define sobriety as the opposite of addiction. And if the opposite of addiction is connection, then connection is sobriety. It just sounds weird how he says the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, because addiction is, the dysfunction or dependency on said behavior, and sobriety would be abstinence of said behavior. So if the opposite of addiction is connection is sobriety, which I agree with. I think that is crucial and critical. But the big problem I have with the TED Talks is that it's something that doesn't. It kind of comes from the whole point of Dr. Bruce Alexander's research is with the chemical hooks, because I think he has a misunderstanding of essentially the big missing part of the whole TED Talks is the human brain element, because we're not rats and we don't have the same conditions as rats. We don't get to live in a healthy cage that's like heaven, and we don't have the same kind of conditions as that, where we get to live without stress-free into one can really easily see the manipulation that goes into the rat park experiment. We don't, human society doesn't have this like humans trapped in this, in a single room with only morphine water compared to other humans who live, at a theme park. The examples are a bit exaggerated, and it's also with rats. The whole Bruce Alexander's experiment is very helpful for showing the social part of, like the social strain that addiction has, and the social impact really that just involved in addiction. But the whole TED Talks is almost denying that there's any sort of brain chemistry change in your head, in our head. And that's why the talk last night was important, because for human brains, for the neurologists and for any medical science, there's clearly a change in brain chemistry. Oh, and I also have one more other criticism. Hari and Dr. Alexander had both agreed or thought that, if people go to the hospital and they have morphine in their body for 5 or we'll just say 10 days, and just for a certain amount of days, and then they got out, they should be addicts. And see, I think they're setting up a false premise, because when you're given the drugs at the hospital, you're giving them in a regulated rate as to not become addicted. Some people it does end up happening with, and I mean, they're really not kind of worth including, just in the sense where it's such a small amount of people that coming out feeling any type of need for the chemical. Usually they have prior addictive behaviors already, because addiction is something that you can't just give it. It's a behavior. It's you wouldn't just give someone morphine and then they're addicted to it, or even give it to them over the series of days. It would be a particular pattern that is followed, and that is not an addictive pattern. That is a regulated medication that's given dosage at times to prevent specifically any type of addiction or addictive behavior. They won't let you take X amount of morphine so many times. They'll only give you so much at such a dosage at such a rate. So their hospital example is a little flawed, because there's just no way to establish an addictive behavior. The only thing I don't like about the TED Talks is that there's a denial of any brain involvement, and they're using rats to demonstrate it. And human brains aren't the same as rat brains, of course. They're making an equivocation fallacy there in a way, because they're just not 100% representation of us. And medical research has clearly found damage and or changes to the brain activity that just change how your brain works. So we can't deny the medical science, but we should try to hear both sides of the story and try to understand, here's what we found here, here's what we found here. Instead of saying it's either or, perhaps they're working together and we just need to figure out exactly how. But addiction's always fought with connection now, and that's how I've gone about this. We all connect in different ways, and I was struggling to get the connections I needed to. This was a way to build a new connection while also honing skills that I had admired and wanted to hone, develop, and just make changes in my life that I wanted to. So really, this experiment, I feel, is demonstrating Hari's point, but I just still don't. I disagree with the complete conclusion of the TED Talks that it doesn't have to do with brain activity. I think they misrepresent it by labeling it as chemical hooks, because it's not like alcohol gets in my blood system and then alcohol goes in my brain and then I need specifically alcohol. It's it works differently than that, and that's how they paint the picture. I feel like even this experiment demonstrates Hari's point by me establishing a connection to fix my addiction issues, but without disagreeing with the brain chemistry, neurochemistry side of things, because it's very evidenced that a change in brain chemistry, and I just can't reiterate that enough, that when we do become addicted to things, the problem is that we don't have normal brain chemistry, so we're kind of inhibited from being that normal member of society, and that entrapment of not being able to connect again, I think that is the addiction. You've created a cage for yourself and you're struggling to get out, is the whole point. Portugal is found to help people break out of these cages. For me, I've had to kind of fight my way out till I found this way, but I managed to find this way. I mean, I do think this is the answer for addiction, where it needs to be treated as rather than punished. It shouldn't be a crime and these people locked up in cages, because it just reiterates the problem of helping them reestablish social ties and social connections, makes them important to society, which effectively eliminates any need of the addiction, and would then wash that pattern, that behavior out of the brain, or replace it. Conclusively, that's it. There's still more I might even go into about this tomorrow, but this was really important to go over. Addiction is a pretty broad subject, so I'm going to try and see if there's even more I can talk about here. But I hope this was insightful. I'll try and post some links to some interesting articles in the description below, just as kind of cite my sources, and also have in case anyone wants to do some reading on some of this, because it is interesting and helpful information to know. But thanks so much for hearing me out and for listening. Any points you want to make or questions, just leave, of course. Gladly, I'm happy to talk about it. I don't have all the answers. I'm always looking, and this is just the best answer that I can put from the evidence so far. But there's always more to discover. So thanks again for listening. Hope you learned something. I hope you learned something. I will see you tomorrow's entry 23, and that's it. Take care. Bye-bye.